Hello everybody, here with my very first completely unscripted video. If you're watching and enjoying, hello. If you're watching and not enjoying, I hope you click off the video much later on in order to give me more ad revenue. But that aside, let's quickly go over these characters and the archetypes they represent. Here we've got Ragna up at the very top left. He's my stand-in for a Shoto. As I've talked about in the Shoto video and the Brawler video, I don't really like the term anime Shoto, and I don't really think Ragna fits cleanly into either. He's got a little bit more of a Midranger thing going on, but this is our Shoto for this video. Jin and Mai for this video is Midrangers, Arakune and Platinum for item throwers, Rachel and Kokonoi for trap characters, Hakumen.
I am the White Void. I am Cold Steel. I am the Just Sword.
For Parry characters, Makoto isn't necessarily a boxer, but she's our stand-in for this game. Bang, who is our one-shot character. Azrael, who is our bully. Naoto, who is, for the sake of this video, the Brawler. And Hibiki, who is essentially our Demon Flip character. We're going to start off with the very top, Ragna or Shoto. Shotos don't tend to perform particularly well, but sometimes in some games characters can be overtuned or overdesigned, so I'm going to put them just like a little bit above the middle center. Characters like Evil Ryu bring out like the bad in this archetype, and Luke has been guilty of this in Street Fighter as well, where a Shoto is just essentially overtuned on purpose for some reason, and winds up really overperforming. But as for theoretical versus practical, like, there's not really a wrong way to play a Shoto, and so you can get very experimental. Daigo was pretty much known for this in Street Fighter 4, the whole reason people come up with the Umehara Shoryuken, which is essentially his practical, special technique, is that his hard reads, the things that he would dedicate to, are essentially insane, but he was right much more often than not, and that gave him a reputation for being a fantastic Shoto representative, and it's essentially defined the way that people view that archetype in general. But on paper, these characters tend to be just completely white bread. They can respond to most things, but they tend to be around 4 or 5 interaction characters, which, as I've talked about in what makes a top tier, interaction count really matters. I mean, these characters, speed characters, are one of the few 4 or 5 interaction characters that can win off bat, but for the most part, you want to be a 3 or lower interaction character, like up here with our Footsies characters. So next we got the Midranger. Fortunately for them, the Midranger has all of the strengths and loses most of the weaknesses of the Shoto. An interesting thing about them is that they tend not to have particularly strong projectiles, but I mean, in most games, projectiles aren't winning you matches very often. There's characters in BlazBlue, Under Night, and a few other franchises that are known for this, and in older fighting games they did tend towards being stronger than they are nowadays, but for the most part, having a little bit of a weaker projectile game is generally something most people would love to trade out for better frame data, stronger normals, etc. And again, we're going to go right in the middle axis of this theoretical practical divide here for the Midranger, because these characters are just very white bread, they perform very strong, and they can be played kinda however you like. You can go a bit berserk, or you can play them completely white bread, and it works. Anything's going to work with them, and that's generally what makes them strong. Now for one of our first theoretical low tiers, we're gonna go with item thrower. Arakune in this game, this guy right here, is an S tier probably. His runaway is just absurd, and it's very difficult to punish him for playing the way that he wants, and he can essentially just chip damage you to death. He might be around S tier or so, but he's like a 10 interaction character. If you watch any match footage of him, it's heartbreaking, to say the least. I love this character, I love his design, I like the way he plays, I think it's very interesting what he brings to the game, but he's very annoying, and it's, an edge case scenario that he's this strong. Characters like Platinum here are not as strong and tend to do okay, but, you know, for the most part, item throwers are giving up their knockdowns to throw items, which come into effect after the opponent rises, but a lot of the time they can just bypass your item by right of them standing back up, which really leaves you in a sour spot and performing poorly. You see this in characters like Faust and Nekoark, where they wind up not doing as much damage, they wind up not getting any knockdown pressure, and if they are getting knockdown pressure, they're not throwing out their items, so they have a weaker neutral game and weak win condition. So as a result, they're probably low tiers and their damage is highly impractical. While theoretically there's some incredibly nasty stuff you can do if you get their god item, which I discuss a little bit in the item thrower video if you haven't watched. For the most part, the opponent can also use some of your items against you and stuff. Things are just balanced overall against the item thrower in most matchups. However, on the opposite side of things, we've got the practical and high tier trap characters. So I'm gonna place them about where the Midranger is. Characters like Byakuya and, as you can see here, Kokonoi and Rachel, they get an insane amount of damage out. They really control the neutral. You can watch any of these characters played in high tier, or you can watch Testament in old Guilty Gear and really see what trap characters can do when they're at their best. But it tends to be that they're getting good knockdown pressure, their neutral is astounding because of the traps in neutral, and they're not really giving anything up on their knockdowns. It's like a polar opposite situation to what item throwers have, which is, you know, handy given I just placed them just a couple seconds ago. But the fact that trap characters are forwarding their win state after their knockdowns, as well as getting standard knockdown pressure on top of that, like, you're waking up into a whirlwind every single time you get knocked down in one of these matches, and it can be really harmful to you attempting to win in any extent whatsoever. These characters are really hard to balance right, and for the most part, if they are done well, it's characters whose traps kinda take a back seat and are just a kind of tertiary thing and don't entirely define their meta. You might maybe label a character like Street Fighter 6 Blanka under something like this, where his dolls don't really do anything except on knockdown, but for the most part he's an entirely different archetype and just uses his traps as a kind of bonus to forwarding his win state when he's already winning a lot. Parry characters, this is heartbreaking to say, but I'm going with just slightly above item thrower, I think. The thing with parry characters is hard dedicating to a read, which I already talked about a little bit with Shoto's, is really risky. And that's what you're betting your whole win state on. Again, Hakumen here, he's an A or B tier depending on who you ask. He's very good, but he has very long range normals, and he's a very good defensive character who does a lot of damage any single time that he gets anything out. So just like I said, Arakuni might be amazing and he's a 10 touch character, Hakumen can often be the same. He gets a lot of damage out off of any given hit, but it still will wind up maybe close to 10 hits to end the round. A lot of parry characters might have fantastic combos that do roughly the same damage as their parries, or they can parry into combos. You can see this on characters like Baiken, who is very unorthodoxly designed, but she gets a lot of damage off any touch, and it's very easy for her to get a lot of touches around. Her parries in particular are much lower commitment than a lot of other parry characters, but for the most part, parrying in fighting games is something that you don't see the pros do very often. It might astound beginner players to see how rarely parries are used in Street Fighter 6, for example, where parries are a universal mechanic, but because they are hard dedicating, it's a very different situation to something like third strike parries, where you can just throw them out constantly and you'll see them used in defining that game. Parry characters are just in a very difficult spot in terms of the fighting game meta, where hard dedicating to something that is essentially a guess is, 50-50, literally half the time, not going to go your way, and that leaves them on the lower end of the spectrum. Now for boxers, I actually think boxers are an interesting design point in that they're true neutral. I talked about this a little bit in the video, but boxing characters are more so designed around the sport than they are around fighting games, and as a result, they can wind up having weirdly high placements or weirdly low placements. I mean, it's really up to you how you interpret the sport of boxing. I think, for recent examples, Ed from Street Fighter 6 is a very, very interesting design. In Street Fighter 5 he was a lot more of an in-fighter, but Street Fighter 6 has given him whip punches, similar to Ryuji from KOF, which is generally how in Japan they tend to depict outfighting. Outfighting is a very weird keep-away form of boxing that isn't generally commonly known. I think a lot of people that don't watch a lot of boxing have no idea it even exists as a technique, but there have been some very successful fighters with it and some, not so successful fighters with it, both in fighting games and in reality. So given boxing covers so much of the fighting game spectrum, and is kind of adjacent to fighting games in terms of just how much player expression there is in boxing as a sport, I think boxing is actually better than the Shoto at depicting just a true neutral for fighting games. It's really what you put into it as a player, as well as what the devs decide to put into it and how they see the sport and want to integrate it into their game. Now for something I know a lot of you are probably very excited for, I'm going to rank the one-shot, which I'm putting slightly high tier and in theoretical. One-shot characters are in a strange position in fighting games where they essentially get one shot every round to just win the round for free. And that is astounding. That's an ability that almost no one else has. But as I've talked about, winning in very few interactions is generally something you really, really want if you want to place high tier. I actually think that probably puts them a little bit more in line with the Midranger now that I'm thinking about that. But as a result, one-shot characters can really, really be seen quite often. Even if they're low-tier characters, you'll see them in tournaments in top 8s, surprisingly commonly. And that's just because they have this gambit lying in their back pocket, where they can just suddenly pull out a win from a losing situation in a single interaction. That's something that's so valuable that even though a lot of their general gameplay when they're not in their win state is fairly weak, the ability to win in very few interactions is so strong you wind up seeing these characters in tournaments constantly. And that's why I think that the one-shot character is really, really good. Probably one of the top 10 fighting game archetypes overall, including a lot of the ones that I haven't even ranked yet. Now for Bully, this is kind of upsetting to say as well. I'm gonna go for practical but slightly low tier. As I talk about in the Bully video, it's all about invulnerability frames, armor, like a lot of things like that. Bullies are all about saying no, rejecting your opponent's game plan and chewing through them. So that means just like Punisher characters or Footsie's characters, whatever you want to call them, they have guaranteed damage when they just respond to something, not reacting. So they have to make a lot less guesses than most people. But characters like Sagat, Azrael, a lot of the other big Bully characters, DBZ Broly, they can wind up just saying no, but not really doing very much damage. I showed this in the video with things like DBZ Broly's Ki Blast. A lot of people were astounded by the fact that it chewed out all other projectiles in the game, and so people would commonly quote that DBZ Broly, the grappler, is the best zoner. Although really those projectiles didn't matter very much because they do so little chip damage, both on block and on hit, that you're never going to win a round purely off hitting with those projectiles and zoning the opponent out. Really, for these Bully characters, it's about your ability to respond to the opponent well, react to their neutral, and try and enforce your game plan, but that can be a little bit of a mixed bag. Sagat has a very interesting history of this, where sometimes he absolutely dominates games, and in a lot of games he just falls off the face of the earth. Now that's because whether you base a Bully character off of their special moves, like Tiger Shot, Tiger Knee, etc., things that close gaps or their projectiles and stuff, that can make them actually a lot weaker than if you base the Bully off of their normals. A character like Marissa in Street Fighter 6 is a really interesting example of this, because of her armored special moves being designed a lot more like a character like G from past games, rather than things like projectiles and the like. she gets to get in and play a lot more space denial and have a lot stronger knockdown pressure than most other bullies have. So I think that's a good way to design these characters in future, and to keep this kind of archetype going into games from here and beyond, rather than letting them kind of go a bit stale and die out. That puts us onto Brawler, which I'm going to put hexagonally with the Shoto and the Midranger. Brawler characters are, again, quite a mixed bag. I think the combat magnetism that I talked about makes them very easy though. If you haven't watched that video, combat magnetism was a bit of a trait that I had coined for it, where these characters' normals, their combos, their block strings, etc. will constantly bring them back into range to attack the opponent further. Basically, the opponent has to manually interrupt the Brawler, or the Brawler has, on paper, infinite pressure. However, this reliance on strike throw and their command grab mix-up or regular grab mix-up, however you want to line it up, whatever your character's implemented as, can mean that they're quite hard to pressure an experienced opponent with. Larger content creators than I, like Lord Knight, quite commonly mock this archetype, calling them honest mids Michael or other things of the sort, basically implying that if you just block, you're really not in much danger, and for the most part, that's pretty true. Characters like early Guilty Gear Strive Soul can have a dominating presence in the meta when their normals, their frame data, and the pressure situations are overtuned, but for the most part these characters are actually very well balanced, they're very simple in design, and do have to take risks to pressure you. While in Guilty Gear that can be mitigated with meter, and I suppose in BlazBlue as well, as you can see on screen. BlazBlue has a mechanic called Rapid Cancels that effectively is literally a Roman cancel from Guilty Gear. Brawler characters can just wind up facing a bit of a fall off in the meta in a single patch, and that's because their on paper game plan is so simple that they're really relying on what the devs give them. However, I find that in-game and in implementation, generally this leans towards very good tournament results, as they're easy to play. I only have to win around 3 to 5 interactions depending on the game, and their game plan's so solid that even with weaker frame data than other characters, if they are in a bad patch cycle, they can generally pull wins out just because of how reliable and simple their game plan is. That leaves us with one last puzzle piece, which is the demon character, which I'm going to put at theoretical and just under top tier. These characters you don't see in S tier quite as commonly as a speed character, generally in something like A+, just bordering on broken but not quite. And that's generally because a lot more people have a much easier time seeing that these characters don't tend to get results, and it's because of things like devs going out of their way to give them poor defense, low HP pools, whatever it is that they try and balance them with. These characters might have on paper extremely good game plans and very strong mix-ups, but how restricted they can be to the demon flip can generally be quite a weak point. Street Fighter V Akuma is a very good example of this, as I showed in that video. His dive picks are very slow, and that means that overall his pressure can be quite weak, a lot weaker than you might expect for a character like him. But for the most part, these characters take a kind of average amount of risks and win in an average amount of interactions. They might have on paper more damage than other characters and might look ascending, but in an actual game, they're winning in 3 to 5 interactions, which is basically the average for most fighting games and most characters. Quite similar to Shoto's, but their tools are just a little bit more overtuned, and these characters can generally have a Shoto-esque moveset, much like Akuma does, but with mix-ups added into their moveset to account for. That means that they have the white bread, on paper, really simple, just respond to the opponent, don't guess, playstyle, but they can also play completely berserk, put the opponent in the vortex, and win off their own merits. So that can mean that these characters just suddenly pull games out of the bag and perform very well out of nowhere. So I think that's it for the tier list. I think I've gotten everything I wanted to say about these guys out of the way, and looking at the spread, I'm fairly happy with it. I think this is where on any day I would most likely place these archetypes. There's definitely a lot of white spaces you can see. I've only covered 12 archetypes so far, so there's a lot more to come, and believe me, there's a lot more in the roster of BlazBlue to cover too. But For the most part, I think I have a good idea of what other archetypes I would place in theoretical low tier and practical low tier, as well as practical top tier archetypes that I haven't had the chance to cover. But what do you guys think? Is there anything I missed out? Is there any placements here you disagree with, or any reasoning that you think I got wrong? You can just tell me in the comments below, and I'm more than happy to have a discussion with just about anyone, even if you come in swinging like some people want to do for some reason. If you'd like to support me, it's just as easy as leaving a like in the video and subscribing. You could even push the bell for notifications if you love my videos and want to see them the instant that they come out. But that's going to be all for this video, and as always, I'm going to leave you all by saying, stay safe.